Allow me to welcome you to this seminar marking the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. I'm David North, and I serve as chairman of the International Editorial Board of the WSWS. I will be co-moderating this event. This anniversary unfolds amid an escalating assault on democratic rights and the foundations of American democracy. The president has spoken openly of establishing dictatorial rule. After losing the 2020 election, he attempted to overturn its result and block the peaceful transfer of power. His return to office in 2024, despite this criminal act, is a sign not only of a breakdown of democratic institutions, but also a profound erosion of democratic consciousness. Under these conditions, the American Revolution assumes immense contemporary significance. These are times, as Tom Paine said, that try men's souls. We are not only commemorating a national anniversary. The American Revolution was never merely an American event. From its earliest days, it was understood to have world historical significance. When Paine wrote that the cause of America was the cause of all mankind, he expressed the fact that the struggles in the colonies posed universal questions: monarchy or republicanism, inherited privilege or popular sovereignty, colonial subordination or self-government. The Civil War, too, which arose out of the first revolution, likewise had world historical significance. It destroyed slavery and posed anew whether the democratic principles proclaimed in 1776 could be made real. As the most thorough bourgeois democratic revolution in history, it created the conditions for the explosive development of capitalism and the emergence of the United States as the dominant world power. It also gave rise to a massive working class and a history of violent class conflict, with which the development of the great civil rights movement of the last century, and even the recent decades, was inseparably linked. Today, however, the political attack on democracy is accompanied by a repudiation of the democratic and revolutionary legacy of 1776 and the Declaration itself. Within academia, and within much of what describes itself as the left, the American Revolution is presented not as a world historical advance, but as a reactionary event. All the documents and political structures that prepared and emerged out of the revolution are dismissed. The Declaration is treated not as a statement of universal principles whose implications exceeded the intentions of its author, but as hypocrisy and deception. But to claim that all the brilliant political work produced to justify the revolution, from the vast opus of the European Enlightenment that provided the intellectual philosophical inspiration for the revolution, and the Declaration of Independence itself, to say that all this was nothing more than an attempt to cover over the counter-revolutionary aims of the American struggle for independence, is akin to claiming that Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel to cover up a crack in the ceiling of the Vatican. Conflict over the meaning of historical events is legitimate and unavoidable. No serious history can proceed through patriotic myth-making. The American Revolution was born in contradiction. Its promises were denied to enslaved people, women, indigenous peoples, propertyless laborers, and many others. It was, to define the events in appropriate historical and socioeconomic terms, a bourgeois democratic revolution, with all the contradictions and limitations that implies. The revolution did not accomplish all that it promised. Life and liberty, to say nothing of happiness, are increasingly problematic in the United States today. And given the massive concentration of wealth that characterizes contemporary society, what rules today in Washington is not by a long shot what Lincoln had in mind when he spoke of government of, by, and for the people. But history cannot be understood through moral denunciation. A moralizing attitude toward the past has no explanatory power, least of all in the study of revolutions. To say that the founders were hypocrites does not explain why a revolution occurred, why the Declaration acquired force beyond their intentions, or why its language was taken up by abolitionists, enslaved people, workers, socialists, and civil rights fighters. And it does not explain how the world we live in came into being. A theory of history must explain more than one selected event. It must account for broad historical processes: the American Revolution, the Civil War, the French Revolution, 1848, the rise of socialism, industrial unions, the Russian Revolution, anti-colonial struggles, and the social movements of the 20th century. This is why the replacement of class conflict with racial theory has such far-reaching implications. If racial conflict is made the central axis of history, the working class is reduced in significance as a world historical force. Socialism is severed from the democratic revolutions, whose unfulfilled promises it sought to carry forward. The October Revolution, certainly a titanic event in the 20th century, becomes inexplicable on its own terms, as a product of war, class conflict, state collapse, socialist consciousness, and the struggle for workers' power. Now, of course, slavery, colonialism, and racial oppression have played a major role in American history. But they cannot be understood apart from property, labor, class power, imperialism, and the state. The Declaration, in our view, was revolutionary not because its authors were morally pure, but rather because it indicted the existing social and political order of its time and called for its overthrow in the most sweeping and universal terms. It provided the political and ideological impulse for the subsequent extraordinary economic development, territorial expansion, and social transformation of a colonial outpost into an independent and increasingly powerful capitalist nation state. And at the same time, the democratic principles that it evoked transcended the objective limitations imposed upon it by its own time. Herein lay the great and enduring power of the Declaration. It was both of its own time and of the future, of the present. The Declaration expressed in the most profound sense the dialectic of history. As Marx explained, mankind thus inevitably sets itself only such tasks as it is able to solve, since closer examination will always show that the problem itself arises only when the material conditions for its solution are already present, or at least in the course of formation. In 1776, the conditions for the abolition of slavery were only beginning to emerge. By 1861, the conditions for the completion of that task were at hand. And the transition from the first to the second stage of the American bourgeois democratic revolution proceeded rather rapidly. The first revolutionary era was not all that distant to those who played major roles in the abolition of slavery. For example, Thaddeus Stevens, the greatest of the radical Republicans, was born in the early years of George Washington's presidency. When Abraham Lincoln was born, Thomas Jefferson still occupied the newly constructed White House. The American Revolution accelerated the movement against slavery. Relative to our own time, 77 years, the distance between the Declaration of 1776 and the Gettysburg Address of 1863 takes us back to 1939, the start of World War II. And does that event seem so distant? Thus, in the discussion of the revolution, what is at stake is not only the interpretation of the past, but the political consciousness and perspective required for the future. If all those who consider themselves on the left abandon the revolutionary democratic tradition, if it treats equality, rights, popular sovereignty, and the universal emancipation proclaimed by the Declaration of Independence as rank deception, it risks surrendering that powerful tradition to reaction. And that is what has been happening. Now, there are many, many different interpretations of complex events, with historians placing different emphasis on different aspects. But the precondition for serious debate must be a scrupulous attitude toward facts. The 20th century has shown the catastrophic consequences of historical falsification, above all in the falsification of the Russian Revolution, where lies justified betrayal, repression, and mass murder. We certainly have not reached that point in the United States. The bloated orange colossus who imagines that he bestrides the Potomac has feet of clay. Social opposition is steadily growing. But the opposition of workers and youth and intellectuals must be armed with a knowledge of history and its lessons. The important anniversary must be an opportunity to ask what was revolutionary in the revolution, what was limited, what was betrayed, what was carried forward, what had to be rejected, what had to be maintained, what had to be resolved. With that, let me welcome our panelists. James Oakes is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History at CUNY Graduate Center and one of the foremost historians of slavery, anti-slavery politics, and the Civil War era. His work has twice been awarded the Lincoln Prize, including for The Radical and the Republican, on Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, and for Freedom National, a landmark study of emancipation during the war. His scholarship has fundamentally reshaped historical understanding of the relationship among anti-slavery politics, the Constitution, and the waging of the Civil War. Richard Carradine joins us from Britain, where it is sweltering hot. He has served there as president of Corpus Christi College in Oxford and established himself as one of the leading biographers of Abraham Lincoln. Like Jim, Richard is also a two-time Lincoln Prize winner for his books on Lincoln, A Life of Purpose, and this past year for Righteous Strife, How Religious Nationalists Forged Lincoln's Union. Richard's work explores the relationship between politics, religion, democracy, and reform in American history, shedding light on the complicated ideological forces that shaped the Civil War and the struggle against history. Sean Wilentz, who joins us from, I believe, an equally sweltering Berlin, is the George Henry Davis 1886 Professor of American History at Princeton University and a Bancroft Prize-winning historian. He is best known for Chance Democratic, The Rise of American Democracy, Jefferson to Lincoln, and No Property in Man, works that trace the evolution of American democracy and the conflicts over slavery from the founding through the Civil War era. His scholarship explores party politics, social conflict, and constitutional struggle in shaping the American Republic. Through a body of work spanning several decades, Sean has helped explain both the revolutionary promise and the explosive contradictions of the American founding. Adam Hochschild is a widely read historian and journalist of encyclopedic knowledge, whose work has brought questions of empire, slavery, war, and human rights to a broad audience. His books include King Leopold's Ghost on the Congo, Bury the Chains on the movement to abolish slavery in the British Empire, and American Midnight, a powerful account of repression and democracy in the United States during and after the First World War. It is a book which has profound relevance to the present situation we confront in the United States. Across these studies, he highlights the operations of state power and violence against historical progress and democratic rights. Thomas Mackaman is John H.A. Whitman Distinguished Service Professor of History at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, a scholar of labor and immigration history. Tom is author of the book New Immigrants and the Radicalization of American Labor. Tom also writes historical essays for the World Socialist website, and in 2019 conducted a series of important interviews with leading historians in response to the 1619 Project, including with Jim and Richard, who are in this meeting, as well as with James McPherson, Claiborne Carson, Victoria Bynum, and with Gordon Wood, who passed away this month. Eric Lee, today's co-moderator, is a federal civil litigator specializing in immigration and constitutional law. In 2024, he argued Department of State versus Munoz before the U.S. Supreme Court, and he has since represented Cornell's Mamadou Tal and Yale law scholar Helye Doutaghi in landmark cases challenging the criminalization of political speech. He has also helped defend Hayam El-Gamal and her 5 children against the Trump administration's efforts to deport them. When planning for this webinar began last month, Tom exchanged messages with Gordon Woods, who was, as always, supportive of the efforts of the World Socialist website to defend historical truth. In those exchanges, his intellectual vitality and engagement with history and its relation to the problems of the contemporary world remained undiminished. We were therefore shocked and deeply saddened by Gordon's untimely death on the 7th of June. And so, as an introduction to today's discussion, let us view a short clip from an interview that Tom conducted with Gordon Wood in November 2019.
This is Tom Mackaman with the World Socialist website. We're here at Brown University speaking with Gordon Wood. Gordon Wood is a professor emeritus of history and one of the leading scholars of the American Revolution. His book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, was a Pulitzer Prize winner. So thank you, Gordon, for being with us. My first question simply, what was your initial reaction to reading Project 1619?
Well, I got my Sunday paper a few months ago and was surprised to see this 1619 project in the Sunday magazine of the New York Times. I had no awareness that it was being done, and I was surprised, as many other people were, by the scope of this thing, especially since it's going to become the basis for high school education and has the authority of the New York Times behind it, and yet could be so wrong in so many ways.
Well, we've discussed the claim that the revolution was really about founding a slavocracy, and that the American Revolution was really a counter-revolution to defend slavery.
I don't think people realize just what a cruel and brutal world existed, not just for slaves, but for lots of people who were considered the mean sort or the lowly. And what it means to say that all men are created equal. The implications of that education is important. I mean, I think the important point to make about slavery is that it had existed for thousands of years without substantial criticism. Slavery existed in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, and of course in Latin America and North America. But it's the revolution that makes it a problem for the world. And the first real anti-slave movement takes place in North America. So this is what's missed by these essays in the 1619 Project. And it's a massive movement against slavery that's unprecedented in the history of the world. So to somehow turn it around and make us into a slaveocracy. The slavery is confined to the South after the Revolution, and that puts them on the defensive. And they, for the first time, they have to defend the institution. Now, you also should understand that slavery is part of a whole hierarchy of dependencies. There's servitude. I mean, half the population that comes to the immigrants who come to the colonies in the 18th century, not aside from the prisoners, the convicts who were sent here, but were bonded servants. Now, servitude is not slavery, but it is a form of dependency. You sign over your life to a master for 5, 7 years. You can't marry, you can't own property. You belong to that master, and he can sell you. But it's not lifetime, and it's not racially based. But it is a form of dependency. That is attacked, as all forms of servitude are attacked and eliminated. In the North, slavery is abolished legally. Northerners come to realize that the South really wants to perpetuate slavery and extend it into the West. And the South comes to realize that the North is opposed to slavery, will never allow them, will not allow them to extend it. And from that moment on, I think the Civil War is inevitable.
Well, it's wonderful to have that record of Gordon Wood's views on the essential significance of the American Revolution. Listening to what Gordon had to say, let me ask all of you who are participating in this, all the speakers, if you had to be asked what you think, or if you had to quickly sum up or concisely sum up the significance of the Declaration of Independence, its place in world history. I don't know how you concisely sum that up, but if you had to try to explain why this is an anniversary of great significance and meaning, if you believe it is, what would you say? Jim, you want to take the first shot at this?
Sure. I think I'll paraphrase Abraham Lincoln here. I think the Declaration of Independence, the principle of fundamental human equality, the assertion of universal rights, establishes an entirely new revolutionary standard by which every social movement from that point on is evaluated and invokes, the women's rights movement, and the abolitionist movement. And I just signed off on a dissertation which showed that labor radicals in the late 19th and early 20th century repeatedly invoked the Declaration of Independence. It is hard to imagine any sort of social progress that has happened in the last 200 years without that as the fundamental baseline from which, all social movements for progress proceed.
Sean?
Just to say what Jim said and what Gordon said earlier in a slightly different way. I mean, as I see it, there were two great revolutions that were occurring in the 18th century. One was the revolution against monarchy, against aristocracy. That is the revolution that the Declaration of Independence was the apotheosis of. Not only the idea that all people are created equal, all men are created equal, but people are created equal, but also that government depends on the consent of the governed. These are the two central propositions at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence that make it stand out as the most important document, I think, expression of that first revolution. There is another revolution going on, which is an anti-slavery revolution, which has begun in the 17th century in Britain. And that really takes off for the first time in the American colonies, more or less the same time as the revolution. The Declaration is not specifically about that, although Jefferson had a portion of the Declaration about the slave trade, attacking the slave trade in no uncertain terms, although in terms not unlike those of the rest of the Declaration. You can see those two revolutions very briefly, crossing one another in that passage. But they were distinct. They overlapped. They weren't exactly the same, but they were finally, I think, going to they come together in the most eloquent way, I think, in the Gettysburg Address. Yes. So you can see these two revolutions in effect occurring one after the other or one alongside the other, but then reaching the apotheosis, the true end of it, in the Civil War.
Richard?
I absolutely agree with Sean in what he says about the Gettysburg Address being the point when the whole thing, as it were, comes together in an apotheosis. It's a second form of declaration, really, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit later. But in terms of what I think about with the Declaration of Independence is that it's a formal statement of the end of a world of ascribed status, where your status is determined by those above you, by the establishment, whether it's a monarchy or an aristocratic society, and where men and women are able to establish their independence by virtue of what they are, not by virtue of what others want them to be. So the end of ascribed status seems to me to be what the Declaration of Independence effectively embodies.
Adam?
I would very much agree with what's been said already. I do think that the statements that all men are created equal and that governments derive their just power from the consent of the governed are deeply radical statements, more radical than those who signed this declaration realized, I think. But they do set a high standard. I was rereading the Declaration of Independence this morning and struck by a number of other things that really seem to apply to today, as if they were written this morning. In talking about the king, the Declaration says, he has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. That certainly applies to this crazy terrible war on Iran. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. Notice that Trump just refused to sign that housing bill that came before him unless Congress disenfranchises people the way he wanted. It accuses the king of cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, tariffs, with transporting people beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. I think of the deportations. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. I think of January 6, 2021. And this makes Trump, I think, in the Declaration's words, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people.
I can't help, before I just ask Tom to speak, but I will pose this as a question you will be raising and dealing with later. Then why is it that what calls itself the left, or so much of what presents itself as the left, has repudiated the document from which you've just quoted, and one which is so profoundly relevant to our own time? I think this is an issue which will have to be addressed. But that is a wonderful summation, Adam. Tom?
Yeah, and I agree with that and what Adam just said, and I agree that in rereading the Declaration, how intensely relevant it is to the present. It's surprising in some sense. And David mentioned, and I'd like to lay stress on this, and I think Jim made this point too, that in profound ways, the Declaration rises above the objective limitations imposed on it on the American Revolution by its own time. The idea that it's not states that give rights to people, but just the opposite, that people are born with inalienable rights, and that governments derive their powers only from the people and their consent. And that when governments violate those rights, it is the duty of the people to alter or to abolish that government. That is, it is the right of the people to revolution. And finally, and I think most importantly of all, and Jim made this point, the idea of equality. And that principle of human equality, I think, is the most powerful idea, not only in American history, but in world history. And once it's unloosed and popularized by the Declaration, it tears through all of subsequent history really with terrible force. And Jim made this point. Every subsequent great social movement in American history, the fight against slavery, women's fight for the right to vote, the civil rights movement, and above all else, I would say the labor movement, the movement of the working class. Every one of these movements has inscribed the name equality on its banner.
I was going to ask Eric, he's my co-moderator, but so much of your own work at this moment, including your appearance before the Supreme Court, has largely been based on a defense of the principles of the Declaration and, of course, of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which is the outcome of the Civil War. But could you just explain briefly something about the contemporary relevance of these documents?
Well, we have another example of it today. The Supreme Court has handed out 2 decisions by its perennial 6-3 breakdown, in which the court has ruled that hundreds of thousands of people who are in the United States with temporary protected status and millions of people who are coming to the United States and approaching the border physically from Mexico essentially have no rights whatsoever. And that's the upshot of it. These are decisions which the court is well aware are going to lead to death, people being sent back to Haiti, a country which has been subject to well over a century of American imperialist exploitation. And then the people who aren't allowed to apply for asylum at the border anymore are going to cross unlawfully through the desert, and so many of them are going to die. I think the contemporary value of the Bill of Rights and of the Civil War Amendment specifically are really also, and this is a critical point which I think we can return to both in talking about the Civil War and also in discussing the period of the Palmer raids and the attack on speech and non-citizens and during and in the aftermath of the First World War, but is the idea that the lasting power of the Declaration comes from the fact that its words resonate through the centuries and that they remain deeply, deeply ingrained in the consciousness of masses of people in this country. The speech that Lincoln gives on June 26th in Springfield in 1857, where he's describing the way in which the Dred Scott decision was an attack on the Declaration itself. And in that speech, he says that, in fact, well, I'll just quote the sentence that I think sums it up. He says, in responding to Taney, he says, in the early days, our Declaration was held sacred by all and thought to include all, but now to aid in making the bondage of the Negro universal and eternal, it is assailed and sneered at and construed and hawked at and torn till, if its framers could rise from their graves, they could not at all recognize it. And I wondered if perhaps Professor Carwardine or anybody would like to respond to that.
Can you hear me? I could hear the question. Yes, well, this, of course, has been the theme of Lincoln's use of the Declaration since 1854. In response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which he sees as a complete betrayal of the principles of the Declaration. And the Declaration then becomes a kind of keynote, the lodestar. You can use whatever image you want about the Declaration in Lincoln's political thought, but it's a kind of moral drumbeat of his politics. And it's not the first time that he's press the case that you just, the argument that you just said, that the Declaration of Independence, as he sees it, was designed to apply to all man, meaning all people, and that he understood that Jefferson, for all of his faults, and Lincoln was not a great admirer of Jefferson the man, but a great admirer of Jefferson's principles and Jefferson's argument. Lincoln understood that Jefferson had intended all men to include blacks. After all, Jefferson had drafted 2 elements, I think, in the Declaration, which the Continental Congress struck down, one relating to the international slave trade, or to the general slave trade, and the other to slavery itself. They were removed by the Continental Congress, but Lincoln would have known that what Jefferson had in mind was an all-embracing, a universal statement of the equality of all people. They shared, perhaps I can make this broader point, they shared in the Enlightenment understanding of what you can call rational rather than revealed religion. Lincoln read Tom Paine. He read The Age of Reason. He undoubtedly, as a young man, warmed to it, just as, of course, as Thomas Jefferson had done. And for them, the creator God of Tom Paine was a God who embraced everyone in a benevolent way. This is not a God of revelation. It's a God of reason. It's not a God who both Jefferson and Lincoln rejected the idea of original sin. Neither of them, I think, thought of Christ as anything more than a prophetic figure. So Lincoln is absolutely convinced from 1854 onwards that what he has to do in arguing against the spread of slavery is to found that on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And he does it not only in the argument that you've just said in the 1857 in response to the Dred Scott case, not only in 1854, but all of the great speeches of the 1850s. If I can just quote to you from, you quoted from 1857, there's a speech that he gives, it's the start really of the 1858 campaigns with Douglas, and he's talking about the 4th of July. He said, in every way, we are better men in the age and race and country in which we live for the celebrations that we make on the 4th of July. The electric chord in that declaration links the hearts of the patriotic and liberty-loving men together, as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men throughout the world. But, he says, Douglas's exposition of what the declaration means is, it doesn't matter if slavery is voted up or down. It sustains the Dred Scott decision. It doesn't include the Negro. And Lincoln then says, I should like to know if taking this old Declaration of Independence, which declares that all men are equal upon principle and making exceptions to it, where it will stop. If one man says it does not mean a Negro, why not another say it does not mean some other man? If that declaration is not the truth, let us get the statute book out, in which we find it and tear it out. I have only to say, and I'll pass on to others, but I have only to say, let us discard all this quibbling about this man and the other man, this race and the other race being inferior, and therefore they must be placed in an inferior position, discarding our standard that we have left us. Let us discard all these things and unite as one people throughout this land until we shall once more stand up declaring that all men are created equal. I leave you hoping that the lamp of liberty will burn in your bosoms until there shall no longer be a doubt that all men are created free and equal. This is how Lincoln kicks off what is to become the Lincoln-Douglas debate, during the course of which, of course, he's pushed onto the back foot by Douglas. He comes out with the statement that he's not asking for social and political or for total social and political rights for black men. But he is very clear in this statement to end the quibbling as to who is embraced by the Declaration of Independence. It embraces everyone.
You and Jim, in your writings, have discussed at length the complicated issues surrounding the intent of the Declaration of Independence, the meaning of the Constitution, the different conflicts which were fought out over this. And if you could perhaps, hopefully we'll get Jim back on, but if you could perhaps take some time to summarize your own views of this, particularly in your book, No Property in Man, and warts and all. I mean, I think we have to. This is not just a beautiful story of universal clarification. It was a source of protracted struggle, which ended, thankfully, in a second violent revolution. But could you explain this? Could you try to explain for the listeners what the issue were?
Well, the key word that you just used is struggle. I mean, there was a fight, but the fight was there from the beginning. And the fight in 1787, 88 ended in a particular kind of compromise that was going to be unstable. But there's anti-slavery presence in the Constitutional Convention that few want to talk about too much. But before I get back to that, I want to just add on to some of the things that both Eric and Richard were saying about the Constitution and the Declaration, and Roger Taney. The Dred Scott decision in many ways was a hallmark of what the current Supreme Court majority calls originalism. It was pretending to divine what the framers of the Constitution meant, and made up something completely de novo, and yet came down with this decision. I mean, in some ways, Roger Taney was the original originalist. And Lincoln is calling him on that in 1857, calling him on that directly. Lincoln had said that the Declaration of Independence is like the golden apple. It is a centerpiece of American politics, and around it there is a silver frame, which is the Constitution. The two are connected, right? Directly connected, and that you cannot have the Constitution without the principles of the Declaration of Independence. They inform everything. That was Lincoln's view of how they were connected. But what was going on, as you said, David, in 1787, there was already an anti-slavery movement in America. It existed. In fact, by 1787, it had already completed 3 of the first abolitions of slavery in modern history, in Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. And was on the way of doing so other places as well. In Massachusetts, slavery had been gotten rid of by 1783, immediate emancipation by the Fourth Court of Law. So there was an anti-slavery presence at the Constitutional Convention, and it was very strong. It was represented by, above all, by Gouverneur Morris. He was representing Pennsylvania then, but he's actually from New York. A number of others that were there to deny the idea that the Constitution should admit, as Madison said, should admit of the proposition that can be property in men. That is to say, property in mankind. That slavery is as a national institution. Madison put it that way in his notes, but there was a big fight about all of these things. And if you read the notes that Madison took, which are our best source about all of this, you can see that fight unfolding. Now, so the fight was there from the very beginning, at the very founding of the United States, the fight over slavery. It was going to be a long struggle. It had ups, waned, ebbed and flowed until it reached the point in 1861 where the political as well as the economic and social aspects of it were in place to actually begin the abolition of slavery. But the struggle did not begin in 1830. It didn't begin in 1857 or 54 or 1830. It began at the very founding of the nation. And in many ways, you can also see it in 1776 as well. That struggle is already there. And I think that's something that Americans have missed for the most part. They don't, all history is a history of struggle, one kind or another. And that struggle over slavery, that part of that revolution I originally mentioned, was already part of what was going on in the colonies and in the new states at the American founding.
One thing which I think is important to clarify, and it was suggested by Gordon Wood in his remarks, which we've seen, and that is the whole state of society. And I think your views are probably more sharper on this than Gordon, in the sense that, tell us something about what the nature of, he spoke of a society of dependencies, of forced forms of labor.
Yeah.
What's the reality of American society, and for what reason? And I think this has been entirely abandoned in the 1619 Project.
Well, this is something that's implicit in the revolution of Gordon.
Why did it become a mass movement?
Why didn't
American Revolution? What produced the Sons of Liberty? What produced a mass basis for the level of struggle which evolved certainly by the early 1770s and then explodes in 1775?
Well, I mean, the revolution has different meanings for different people, even though among those who support it. So I don't want to homogenize the revolutionary movement. I mean, it's a coalition in many ways. But your original point, David, I think is very well taken, that Gordon was making, which is that slavery was certainly there, but we're talking about a society which is based, as Richard said earlier, on the proposition of an aristocratic monarchical proposition that your blood determines who you are. And that some people are basically put on the earth to serve other people or to be below other people, and that is an act of God, and it's divine right from monarchy on down. That society had existed for a very, very long time, not just in Britain, but elsewhere. And the American Revolution is the revolution, as Gordon makes, that is the radicalism of the American Revolution, which is to overthrow that order. That sense that society is ordered in castes, if you will, or in various forms of labor, as you point out. There's bound labor, there's indentured servitude. Above that, there's a whole series of other kinds of gradations that are existing. People are dependent in ways that are formal and social and economic and indeed political in ways the American Revolution is going to overthrow. And I think people saw all of that. They may not have seen it all in quite the same way. They may have had different interests in doing so, but they could not accept that order of things any longer.
Let me ask another question, and anyone can respond to this. How did the world see the American Revolution, both in its immediate time and then into the late 19th and 20th century? Was there some, as we were being told, some great misunderstanding? Let me frame it in two. What were the world ideas, the ideas of the Enlightenment? How did they influence the American Revolution, and how did the American Revolution influence subsequent politics in Europe, both French Revolution all the way to 1848, and even into the 20th century? This is a broader general question. Perhaps Adam, would you like to take up that question first?
Well, I actually have in turn a question about it, because it's quite a long time since I've worked in that century. But when I was doing a book some years ago, Bury the Chains, about the British anti-slavery movement, one thing which struck me there was that there was a network of people across countries who cared deeply about abolishing slavery, who were in touch with each other. When the British movement came up with that poster based on the diagram of a slave ship, I'm sure you've all seen it, all your listeners have seen it, that shows the slaves' bodies, packed like sardines into a slave ship. They manufactured this in 1789. It was based on research on a specific ship, on records of its voyages and so on. It's a tremendously powerful graphic, which is still used on book covers and things like that today. They immediately ran off extra copies of this, sent some to their friend Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia, and some to their friend the Marquis de Lafayette in Paris. So there was connections across borders of people who cared about the vision of the world that is put forth in the Declaration of Independence. And as I recall, there are scholars who've said, and Richard, perhaps you know much more about this than I do, that at the time of the American Revolution, there were many sympathizers in England. There were, of course, no opinion polls in those days, but I'm wondering if people have done more work on this in recent years and have a sense of how the American Revolution was experienced and felt in the country that people here were rebelling against.
Sean, then I'll take Richard. We'll give a chance.
Wonderful new book out, actually, by Danielle Allen has just written about the Duke of Richmond. And she has discovered that, well, first of all, there's a great deal of radicalism, and there's a great deal of, I don't want to say majority, but a great deal of sympathy for the American Revolution, even before it was a formal revolution. There's a great deal of English radicalism that gets left out of the story. There's those of you who do English history, there was a series of articles, op-eds really, called the Junius Papers, that appeared in the 1760s, actually, that were attacking the monarchy with all of the brio that is later going to be coming in America. In fact, in some ways, it antedates what the Americans are going to be saying. I mean, it's more or less at the same time. But there is, as you said, there is this international network that is in existence. Ben Franklin seems to be in the middle of almost everything, of course, in the 18th century, but he's certainly in the middle of those. But there's also an anti-slavery network that Anthony Benezet, a Philadelphia abolitionist, really gets going. He's writing to everybody. He's writing to the Empress of Russia to try to get her to be anti-slavery. It's really quite extraordinary. But to answer your original question, David, the world is very much watching what is going on in America, or at least the enlightened world. The enlightened political world is watching what's going on, either in great horror, but also with great sympathy. And the American Revolution, in many ways, seems like the greatest event in the world, in world history to many of these people. And it's going to go on to inspire all kinds of things afterwards in that time. You can't see, when Lafayette brings the key to the Bastille to George Washington, he is saying, this revolution began with you, General Washington, in no uncertain terms. So, you really can't understand any of the other revolutions without understanding the American Revolution. But you can't understand the American Revolution without understanding the pre-existing network of ideas, politics, sentiments that's going on.
Well, it happens to be the case that among those who praised the American Revolution was still alive was Diderot, who considered this a monumental event.
Yes. Can I just add to what
Richard, I'd like you to address a certain question, since the question of English abolitionism has come up, which is obviously very important. But as I was discussing with you earlier, I think it might be, because there has been, again, a tendency to declare that if only the British had won the revolution, if it had been suppressed, that would have been progress. But I think it's important, just because I don't know whether many of our listeners are familiar of the conflict that arose between Britain and the United States during the Civil War. Of course, you had, and this is a great chapter in the history of the British workers' movement, they sacrificed a great deal because of their support for the American Revolution. But the Palmerston government, as well as the government of Louis Napoleon in France, were supporting the Confederacy, and it was one of Lincoln's great concerns that he would be forced to a war with England and France. There's a famous Trent affair. Could you just explain something about it and the climate and its implications? In Lincoln's
yes, just to add a kind of footnote to what Sean was saying, which he put so well. Of course, the radicals in Britain during the 1760s and 1770s, and there are some lovely collections of pamphlets, radical pamphlets on the anti-monarchist pamphlets. But that movement suffered a severe setback when the French Revolution took the turn it did. The Reign of Terror was a crushing blow, really, for many on the radical side of politics. They didn't stop them being radicals, but it actually had a very demoralizing effect on that moment. Coming to the Britain and the American Civil War, well, yes, I mean, of course, there's been consistent attempts to try to identify who it was that supported the Union and who supported the Confederacy. And a kind of simple rule of thumb used to be that, well, the monarchy and the aristocrats were on the side of the Confederacy, and the working people and the reform-minded middle class were on the side of the Union. But it really isn't as simple as that. I mean, part of the problem was the considerable ignorance in Britain about the actual struggle that was going on. Much of it came through the Times, and the Times was by no means a disinterested party in all of this. We can find quite a number of working people who were pro-Confederate precisely because they valued their jobs and and of course the effect of the squeeze on cotton brought about significant unemployment in the Northwest. At the same time, you can find quite a number of liberally minded aristocrats and certainly many middle-class people on the side of the Union. But part of the problem was that, and I say they didn't really know what was going on, Lincoln was being so cautious in expressing what the aims of the war were until we get to September of 1862. that it seemed that what was going on was a suppression of the democratic movement in the South by a union that was really more interested in free trade than it was in ending slavery. And quite a number of those who were opposed to the union took ill against the Morel tariff and the other actions taken by the union administration, which seemed to be in the interest of America, not in the interest of the slave. And of course, it was Gladstone who said that, they thought that the Jefferson Davis was in the business of making not just a government, but a nation. He came to regret what he'd said, but that was how it was seen. The British were much more interested in what was going on in Poland and actually in Italy in terms of nationalism than they were, I think, in the United States. So I'm not meaning to underestimate the significance of the struggle in the United States and Lincoln's articulation in the Gettysburg Address of that this being a war in respect of democracy. And you only have to look at the literal tear shedding that takes place after Lincoln's death, his assassination. Grown men were crying in the streets of British cities when Lincoln died because they saw him as the embodiment of democracy, of the broadened franchise, of widening opportunities for ordinary people. So it's a very complicated story. And of course, historians take refuge behind the complexity of events. But I think in this case, the complexity is down in large part to the fact that there was a lack of grasp of what was happening in America and the constraints that the American Constitution were placing on the Union administration through the war. I know that you can say that there was a little bit of fleet-footedness in respect to the Constitution and the ending of and the Emancipation Proclamation, but again, it was done under Lincoln's powers as Commander-in-Chief. So I think I take the spirit of your question, David, and it's certainly true that there were plenty in Britain who wanted to see the Yankee experiment in democracy fail. Absolutely the case. But I think there were also working people who whose view of what was happening in America was inadequate, and that gave them, I think, a lack of grasp of what was in it for working people more generally.
If I could just add briefly to the point that the points Richard was just making, my reading of it is that it, that to some extent, it divided British opinion along class lines, and we have we're very lucky we have Karl Marx on the scene, and Marx wrote those two extraordinary letters on behalf of the International Working Men's Association to the Lincoln administration, one to Lincoln on his re-election in 1864, and then the second after really beautiful letter after his assassination. Marx was articulating and I think also helping to shape opinion in the British working class. There's I think a memorable part of James McPherson's Battle Cry of Freedom, which I think still is the very best books on the Civil War, he shows the Southern efforts. One of their miscalculations, the Southern ruling class, they thought that by cotton not making it to Britain would very quickly bring the British in and the French in. And as David points out, there was sympathy for doing precisely that in British ruling circles, but the position of the British working class was shocking to the Southern elite. In fact, McPherson cites the words of a Southern spy who was operating in Britain, who said these workers are the most uncompromising in their hatred of our social order. But I think to circle back to David's first question, because I think one of the really big questions, and it's in some ways it's really extraordinary that it comes up, the question mark has been placed in recent years over whether or not the American Revolution was a revolution at all. In fact, that was the standpoint of the 1619 Project. And one of the historians that they cited, a historian named Gerald Horne, actually wrote a book called The Counter-Revolution of 1776. We have actually a very devastating review of that book on the World Socialist website. But so far as I know, and maybe someone will correct me on this, but in its time, nobody thought, including its enemies, but nobody thought that it was anything but a revolution. And it won the sympathy of what Sean and some others, they used the term the Republic of Letters. The radical part of the Enlightenment, of course, welcomed the American Revolution. The monarchies and the aristocracies of course, had a new problem to deal with. So, but I think that this idea that it wasn't a revolution, that's a new thing, and we're and others are fighting against that conception.
My question for Jim was, your works deal at great length and in great detail with the way in which the abolitionist movement was divided insofar in their interpretation of the Constitution, and in the utility which they thought referencing it was either an advance or a blockade on the development of the struggle against slavery. I wondered if there were similar divisions on the role of the Declaration or the Revolution. And I have a follow-up question for Professor Willenz along similar lines, addressing the Constitution as a distinction from the Declaration. But I'll leave it for Professor Oakes to answer this.
I don't think there was much disagreement among abolitionists about the significance of the Declaration. The conflict, and I think we've exaggerated the significance of the disagreement over the Constitution, because I think as the anti-slavery movement moved into politics from the revival of abolitionism in the 1830s, the Garrisonian wing up in Boston became increasingly strident in its opposition to politics, and with it, opposition to critiques of the Constitution. And by the 1850s, their attacks were so strident that they had rendered themselves irrelevant. The overwhelming majority of abolitionists agreed with anti-slavery politicians that the Constitution, in their terms, that within the Constitution, freedom is the rule, slavery is the exception. Right? And they worked within that. There was a more intriguing group of radicals that Frederick Douglass became part of that argued that the Constitution was not simply an anti-slavery document, but was actually an abolitionist doctrine. And those people, I think, while very few politicians agreed with them, they were much closer to the mainstream of anti-slavery politics on the question of the Constitution. They tended to cite the same clauses as Lincoln and the Republicans cited. So I don't think it's the Declaration of Independence that causes a disagreement. It's the Constitution. But again, I think that's been overblown by the fixation on Garrison that really needs to be, pushed to the side so we can get at what most anti-slavery people were thinking. Is it possible for me to go back to another question that I wasn't able to answer the last time? It has to do with David's question about what the world looked like. Here I'm going to take a slightly unorthodox position about the degree to which Northern society was a society of dependency on the eve of the Revolution. There was very little slavery in the North. Slavery was never, with very minor exceptions, for particular times and places, it was not a slave society. The economy was not based on slavery. There was very little slavery in New England, and I think Americans were aware of it. But there was also very little indentured servitude. I think there were two spurts of indentured servitude in the colonial era, one in Virginia in the Chesapeake in the 18th century, and one in Pennsylvania in the early 18th century. But indentured servitude puts itself out of business, right? Because after 5 years, and I think what happened by the eve of the revolution is that Northerners had come to value a society grounded in independency, right? And saw themselves as different from a Southern society based on slavery. So I think that's the sort of underlying condition that made it easier for Northerners to translate their principle of fundamental human equality into an anti-slavery politics.
Sean, would you like to speak to that?
If you want to put it differently, they're coming to appreciate the value of free labor over slave labor.
I was going to just add that the labor point is important. The dignity of labor becomes something that is absolutely intrinsic, important to Northerners in a way that's very, very different from a slave society. And Jim is right. I was talking about the dependencies, but they have faded enormously by the time they get to the 1750s, 60s, 70s. That you have an extraordinarily emerging society unlike anything you'd seen in the world to this point, of independent, for the most part, rural freeholders. I mean, this is something that is going to become the background for everything that's going to be abolishing slavery, but it has to be an attack on what's going on in the South. These two societies are already beginning to drift apart. And indeed, you can see this. I just discovered an abolitionist that nobody had known about before, actually, in Princeton, New Jersey, of all places, or just outside of Princeton, a guy named Benjamin Clark. He already is comparing, Massachusetts and Maryland. This is in the 1730s. The difference between a slave society and what he saw in Massachusetts. And the basis was the dignity of labor as well as the independence of individuals. And that is something that is an enormous foundation, as Tom knows, the foundation of the labor movement, the foundation for a great deal of what's going to be going on in terms of working class politics in this country. But you had to establish the fact that labor was something not to be sneered at, not to be looked down upon, not to be something that only people of no education and no, labor has its own dignity. And that is a very, very important aspect of what's going into the American Revolution.
When it's a transformation from aristocratic society where labor is held in contempt.
Correct.
I would like to, before we come to more conclusion about this discussion and where we are now, or perhaps as a transition to that, have Adam speak somewhat to the book he wrote, American Midnight, and what occurred, the attacks on democratic rights, perhaps summarize them, but also explain what the Declaration meant, or its role in legitimizing or galvanizing or inspiring resistance. How is it invoked? What importance does it have for those who are fighting a brutal regime? I can't help mentioning this to Sean, if only to. There was a time when I was, way back when, where Woodrow Wilson was looked upon as something as a saint of American liberalism. Now, that's one case of historical fraud that we're happy to expose. But if Adam, if you could just describe it, what was going on, and the significance of the Declaration or revolutionary principles for those in the labor movement, the socialist movement, the suffragette movement, who are under a ferocious assault by Wilson.
Okay, well, let me sort of paint a picture of the United States in this period. We're, jumping ahead many decades here from the time we've been talking about to the period 1917 to 21, a period which I'm always fascinated with how quickly it gets skipped over in standard high school history textbooks, which tend to jump straight from the victorious doughboys coming home from having helped win the war in Europe to the 1920s, Prohibition, the rise of Babe Ruth, and so forth. There's a lot of repression that gets skipped over there. I think all I can say relating it to the Declaration of Independence is that the ideals of the Declaration, that people are created equal and governments derive their consent from the governed were pushed aside during this period. What pushed them aside? Two things primarily. One is the United States entered the First World War. And when a country enters a world war on this scale, it gives an excuse for a lot of tensions that are under the surface to boil over. And there were a lot of tensions there. For example, between business and labor, people forget just how violent the situation was, how much violence was met by anybody trying to organize a union. Dozens of people were killed each year. 1913-14 alone, more than 70 people, many of them women and children, were killed when police and company guards put down a miners' strike in Colorado. Well, once there's a war on, it allows the government to say to uppity labor organizers, hey, you're interfering with the war effort, and to crack down even harder. The other thing that stimulated this crackdown was, of course, the Russian Revolution coming in November 1917. Great paranoia among ruling circles in the United States that the revolution might spread here. I don't think there was a chance of that, but it again gave the excuse for an acceleration of the crackdown. The forms that repression took were several-fold. One was censorship on a huge scale. The Espionage Act, which Wilson pushed through Congress very rapidly in the spring of 1917, gave the government essentially the power to shut down newspapers and magazines by denying them privilege of moving through the U.S. mail, which was the only way a national publication could reach its subscribers in the days, before the internet, before email. The government used that law to shut down some 75 newspapers and magazines, the most famous of which was The Masses, which John Reed, Walter Lippmann, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Sherwood Anderson all wrote for. It was really, in many ways, the best and most interesting magazine in the country. It was closed down because the censors objected to an issue in the fall of 1917 that, among other things, had a cartoon of the Liberty Bell crumbling. So this press censorship was one phase of the repression. Another was the political imprisonment of a large number of people. Over that 4-year period, roughly 1,000 Americans spent a year or more in prison, and a much larger number, shorter periods of time, solely for things that they wrote or said. I don't mean that nobody did anything violent in that period, because there were some anarchists who planted bombs and so forth, but these were political prisoners, people who were sent to jail for things they said. One of the most famous, of course, was Eugene Debs, who was sentenced to 10 years for an anti-war speech he gave from a bandstand in a park in Canton, Ohio in 1918. And even though the ostensible reason for the Espionage Act was preventing activity and interference with the war effort, Debs, like many, many other people, was still in prison in November 1920 when he received nearly 1 million votes as the Socialist candidate for president, campaigning from his cell in the Atlanta penitentiary. A third, final aspect of the repression, and then I'll stop, is the rise of militia movements. This is something we see again and again throughout American history. We saw it January 6th, 5 or 6 years ago. I fear we'll see it again. This happened on a huge scale in this period. The largest such movement, something called the American Protective League, was chartered by the Justice Department. While the war was on, they went after people who were supposedly resisting the draft, young men on the street who couldn't produce the necessary papers. They were subject to citizens' arrest. Large numbers of them were rounded up, roughed up, held sometimes for several days until their desperate families could get them the necessary paperwork. Those who couldn't produce it were shipped off to the army. When the war ended, the people who'd taken part in this militia group, the American Protective League, some 250,000 members, incidentally, enjoyed this work so much that they wanted to keep on doing it. And big business was happy to have them as strikebreakers. And under new names, many chapters of the American Protective League continued working as strikebreakers during the very stormy year of 1919, when roughly 1 out of 5 American workers went on strike at one point or another. And there was tremendous violence used against those striking workers. So these are some of the things in that skipped over portion of American history that our high school history textbooks usually didn't deal with.
Well, and Adam, I think maybe the most pithy legal case that emerged from that period along the lines of the themes that we've been discussing is, of course, the United States against the spirit of 76.
Yeah.
The prosecution of the director of the film under the Espionage Act, of the film that was celebrating the American Revolution. Prosecutor was the director was the movie was basically prohibited, and the director was prosecuted for anti-British sentiments. I mean, that brings us full circle on one point, but I think the contemporary relevance of the period which you're describing is even more clear. I'll go to Tom with this, but just because we were talking about the Palmer raids, the roundup in the dark of night of non-citizen socialist, anarchists, trade union members, communists, and the fact that the Palmer raids actually provoked such a shock in the population that they went on for long enough, but the population by and large responded with extreme hostility, or I should say by and large, but a substantial portion of the country knew enough about the democratic traditions of free speech to oppose this. The relevance today, when you see non-citizens being detained for months, rounded out of the country for opposing the genocide, for speech critical of American support for Israel, etc. This is very, very relevant. But the question I have for Tom is, Tom, in your work, you deal specifically, I think, with an element that Adam was just describing, which is the connection between the emergence of American imperialism really on the world scale in a big way for the over at least the 20 years leading up to the entrance into the First World War, and anti-communism as a product of the October Revolution in Russia, but also then the way in which this was weaponized against immigrant workers who had migrated by the millions over the previous 20 years. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that and about how you see your work on those themes as relevant for the political situation today.
Thanks, Eric. Just Adam's book, I think, is a really, really good summation of this period, and very nicely written. Really conveys the horror of this crackdown that it really is organized from the White House. And to your question, I mean, it's here we are in this moment where the Trump administration is leading this vicious attack on immigrant workers, and at the same time, in hearing them speak, Trump and the people around him, you'd think that the communism is everywhere. And this period that Adam deals with and that I dealt with in my book, those two things came together. And Adam mentions the Russian Revolution in 1917. right when the United States is entering the war. Simultaneously to that, and this period 1916 to 22, you have the biggest strike wave in American history, over 1 million workers striking per year. Socialism is gaining big influence, and the Wilson administration becomes convinced that it's concentrated among the immigrant workers. That radicalism is itself socialism is a foreign import. Maybe this actually, and I can bring this as a question to our other panelists, because these things have a longer history than that. In the 1850s, actually, I think Richard was talking about this. Lincoln references this in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. The Know Nothing, the American Party of the 1850s, is the first big anti-immigrant party in American history, and really I think actually Eric Foner made this point in his book, Free Soil, Free Labor, Free Men, that was an effort to bury the labor question. The slavery question in anti-immigrant politics. And I would say that's what the Trump. There's an effort to bury the labor question today, to divide the working class, and going back to I think that Sean deals with this period, the initial anti-immigrant politics is bound up with the French Revolution, and Jefferson and the more radical element of the American Revolution backs the French Revolution, and the Federalists side with begin to shift again toward England, toward Great Britain, the old mother country, and we have the Alien and Sedition Acts of the 1790s. So it's in that sense it's not new, and maybe the other panelists would like to say something about those earlier moments.
I would like to add to that by asking, Sean, you want to go ahead and answer? That's fine. Go ahead. We need your sound.
I just want to make a very quick point, which is the Alien Sedition Act. The only alien of the Alien Sedition Acts, there were 4 of them, that's still on the books, is the Alien Enemies Act. And that is the act upon which Donald Trump has seized in order to do his mass deportations. So if you want to talk about continuities in American history, go from the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798 to the mass deportations of 2025, 2026, and you've got it right there. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I want to ask a question, and everyone I hope will speak to this. I think we all agree is that the American Revolution was a world historical event, one of the titanic events from which so much springs, so much which is progressive. Now, it did not create paradise on earth. No one's figured that how that is done, but it was a monumental step forward for humanity. In my view, as a Marxist, there are 2 world historical documents of the last 250 years. One is the Declaration, the other is the Communist Manifesto. Both of them are profoundly linked, and certainly Marx would have seen it that way. But I want to ask a question, and perhaps preface by recalling a citation from a book on the history of the left opposition by a great Russian Soviet historian, Vadim Rogovin, where he quotes Hegel, and he says Hegel said somewhere that a historian is a prophet who foretells the future in reverse. Or perhaps the present in neutral. Let me ask you the following question. What are the implications? And I think this is a question which is of immense significance. Given the nature of what the American Revolution was, its role in world history, what are the implications for its repudiation by so many academics in the United States? I want to make a point that in the those of you, many of our listeners may notice that many of the participants are, like myself, somewhat advanced in years. I must say that while I know there are many excellent young historians, and many excellent women historians, it was very hard to obtain their participation for fear of retribution, that they are working in what they view as a very hostile environment. So I want to ask the following question. What is the implications for American and world politics, in fact, of a repudiation of the heritage of the revolution, the heritage of the Declaration, and all that flows from it? And I might, in asking that question, make the point that, in my view, a major facilitator of the Trump administration and his attack on democratic rights was the derogation of the progressive and historic implications of the revolution. What do you rest on if you cut out that which is essential to the progressive movement of history? How do you fight reaction? What do you rest on? So I'm going to ask all of you, if you'd like to speak to this, as we come into sort of the final half hour of our discussion. What moment in time are we living in? What is the relationship of the revolution and the debate over the revolution to our time? How significant is it? And if you'd like to address that, it's obviously an immense question, but you're all welcome to contribute what you think is essential. Who'd like to start? Well, I feel like the professor. Well, I'm going to take volunteers. Adam, go ahead. Oh, you got to turn on the mic.
I'll just start with by reading another quotation from the Declaration, which I confess it's a long time before since I had read it again, which I did this morning. And there's a wonderful quotation just in the second paragraph that says, "When a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them," meaning the people, "under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security." So I hope that inspires everybody to go out and join the next No Kings March and to do much more as well. I think you're right, David, to point, as you did initially, to the pressure on people in the academic world to restrain what they say. We've seen shameful instances all over the country of universities caving to Trump as he uses the immense power of the purse and nonsensical things about charging a rise of anti-Semitism and discrimination against white men and all kinds of things like that to put pressure on universities. It's been very sad to see. I also am happy whenever I see pushback to it, which there is quite a bit of as well. I would like to think that kind of pressure, that sort of pressure in the zeitgeist is easing somewhat right now as Trump becomes less popular, but he still has the power of the purse and will be exerting it to put pressure on universities and other cultural institutions of all kinds. Museums, national parks, we've seen the attempt to erase history there. He is going to be doing that as long as he's in power. And I fear the after effects of all that are going to last for quite a while. It makes it all the more important for those of us who see history differently to fight back in every medium we can, whether it's writing books or doing public history in museum exhibits and other ways in which that can be done. It's incumbent on all of us to do that.
Sean, would you like to speak to this?
Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay, good. With everything that Adam just said, the idea that, and this is the state level too, this is not just at the federal level, the teacher at Texas A&M who had to take Plato off of his reading list because it violated their gender and anti-gender and social theory business, some law that the legislature had passed that was against woke stuff. But I think, David, the question you're asking is not so much what's coming out from the right as what's coming from the left, right? I mean, it's that there's a kind of a repudiation on the left of the American Revolution, or I'm using the left in the most, what should we say, loose terms. It's not a left I'm very familiar with because I've never been part of it. I think there's a slight hypocrisy in some ways. I mean, there's a great deal of the idea that there was a contradiction at the foundation of the country, the formation of the country, the national founding, that we were preaching liberty at the same time that we had slavery, right? Ceases to be an interesting contradiction and becomes a form of condemnation. That you may think that liberty is a great thing, but really the only people who were committed to it were those who were oppressed, rather than those who were not oppressed. And this is a formulation of American history, I think, which leads into lots of blind alleys and actually undermines what was actually happening in the 1770s. It diminishes the radicalism of the revolution in very presentist ways. And presentism is a term where you basically judge the past on the basis of what you believe in the present. In the present, we would not want to have a revolution that did not abolish slavery, but in the 18th century, it was a very different situation, materially, culturally, politically, et cetera, et cetera. But because the past did not match our own desires, therefore it's to be condemned. I think that's a part of what's going on with the repudiation of the revolution on the left, and the proliferation of all kinds of social categories, settler colonialism, all the rest of it, which basically, what should we say, drains the radicalism of what was going on away altogether and turns it into basically hypocrisy. And that's an idea that has to be, fought out. But it's one that's caught on with a great power, I think, among younger academics in particular.
Tom?
Yeah, I agree with much of what Sean just said, and it is a real problem in academia. There's a very cynical mood toward the revolution, maybe an admixture of cynicism and an out-and-out hostility to the revolution, to figures like Jefferson, and going forward to the Civil War, figures like Lincoln. What Sean mentioned about presentism, it's as if many of these people can't imagine the past without themselves and their own feelings in it. As we know from some of the great arts reviews we have on the World Socialist website, that's actually a real problem in historical fiction as well. The inability to imagine the past is a very different place. But I would say, and this maybe goes back to the conversation we had with Richard before about the reaction in Britain in the 1860s to the American Civil War. I think there is a difference between the academic, the upper middle class, if you will, around the Democratic Party. And I think we mustn't forget that the 1619 Project was launched by the New York Times, which is as close to an official organ of American liberalism in the Democratic Party as there is. I mean, it came from them. But the mood in the working class, I think, is very different. I think American working class people have always held the Declaration in the American Revolution and the Civil War in high esteem, and it's been difficult to eradicate that sensibility, as inarticulate as it might be. And I think a very significant in response to Trump's monarchical pretensions, very more or less spontaneously, you get this mass movement calling itself No Kings. These are significant. I should say that not too far from me in near Allentown, Pennsylvania, is a rank and file auto worker, Will Lehman, and he's running for president of the United Auto Workers on an insurgent slate against the bureaucracy, which is completely linked to the Democratic Party. And Will is very interested in the workers he talks to are very interested in the legacy of the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Underground Railroad, which passed near where he lives and works. So I think this lives on, and of course, it has to be clarified, and the commitment to historical truth that David mentioned in his opening remarks. I mean, this is why we want to have these kinds of discussions, why we take history very seriously, not as something that you can just sort of go back and alter those facts that you find inconvenient and packaging some sort of sale or for very short-sighted political manipulation. Anyway, I wanted to make that optimistic note.
I know that I'm going to ask Richard to answer this and just preface that, and perhaps repeat and sharpen my question. What are the implications of writing Lincoln out of history and writing the Declaration out of history? And just to a point which, perhaps anecdotally, a few weeks ago, I wrote a letter that purported to be a letter from A. Lincoln. And I tried to, knowing full well this is on very treacherous historical grounds, and it begins with Lincoln acknowledging that he really can speak to a time of which he was not a part, but since he's beseeched to always state his opinion, he'll try to give an answer to the problems of our time. And that letter produced an enormous response. I don't think I've ever written anything which people were so enthusiastic about, because Lincoln occupies such an extraordinary place in the consciousness of broad masses of people. Now, of course, there's always the tendency to even deify a personality. He was a rough-hewn, immensely capable politician, fallible like all human beings, as he would have been the first to admit. But nevertheless, he is associated with one of the great struggles of world history. So I want to ask this very same question then to Richard. What happens to consciousness when political consciousness, present-day consciousness, and I don't think this just applies to the United States, it applies to Britain, it applies today to the entire world, when you have history falsified and misrepresented or simply removed or reduced, and this is a point that Gordon often fought against, presented anachronistically. What does it leave us with? What are its implications?
Well, you've asked a big question there, David, and I'll attempt to address it in a moment. I just want to go back, if I may, to just say how much I agree with what Sean was saying and what Tom has been saying, particularly about presentism, about the assault, as it were, both from left and right, and I use the term in the very broad sense that Sean was using. I'm troubled by what I hear and what I read, but in some ways I'm actually quite upbeat about the future, and I'd like to say about that a little bit about that in a moment. Lincoln, well, Lincoln can't be written out of the story. Lincoln won't be written out of the story. I'm not a Panglossian. I know that it's possible to shield, to screen off whole sections of history and to make them unpalatable or irrelevant. But I don't think Lincoln will ever be written out. Certainly not in the medium term, and he will, I think, continue to be an inspirational figure for those who are looking to find a politician who sought to live by certain key principles. He was, as you say, David, a flawed human being, and I can go into that if you want to. But what I'm most struck by Lincoln is how he set a standard by which he wanted to live and to be remembered. He certainly was ambitious. He certainly wanted to be remembered, but he sought power not by any means. He sought power by means that he was satisfied in his own conscience were means that he could live by and that the world could accept as being moral. He saw the Declaration of Independence as a way of exposing hypocrisy. Those who say that the Declaration of Independence was hypocritical, no, it wasn't hypocrisy. It was an attempt to expose hypocrisy. Certainly that's how Lincoln used it. It was a proposition to which the nation should be dedicated, not a statement of reality. And Lincoln knew that he himself fell short. He was a human being, but he had the capacity to see above himself, to see. One of the aspects of Lincoln's sense of humor, on which of course I have written, is the capacity to stand outside yourself, to see your own foibles and weaknesses. And arguably one of the major problems with your current president is that he is unable to do that. At least it seems to me he's unable to do that. So I don't think Lincoln will be written out. I do think Lincoln will continue to be an inspiration to those who believe in the American democratic way and in broadening democracy. It was a question from Adam about where immigrants featured in Lincoln's own view of the world. And of course, he was canny. He knew he had to get these American party people embraced in the broader anti-slavery coalition, because a lot of those nativists were anti-slavery. But it's interesting that I quoted from his speech in Chicago in 1858. There's a section at the beginning where what he says is, these immigrants, he refers to the German, the French, the Irish, the Scandinavians, they've come from Europe. They have got no blood relationship to the founding fathers, but they are, by that electric cord, I quoted that passage earlier, by that electric cord, they are participants in it. And for Lincoln, they were the equals of those who did have blood relations to the founders themselves. My final, I know we're running out of time, but I was asked a few weeks ago to give a talk to a group in Sheffield on democracy in the United States and the threat to Western democracy. And I knew that my audience were pretty gloomy, and I didn't want to be falsely optimistic. That's far from it. But this was a line of argument that I deployed, and I'd be very interested to see, how you think it plays, which is that the dark side of American history has been there from the beginning. There's been hostility based on race. There's been exclusion. Many examples of that have been thrown up this evening, coming through to the Palmer raids and indeed beyond. This present moment in time, it feels extremely bleak. People who love the United States, as I do, and have spent so much time there in your country, and have been so warmly welcomed and treated by people with the big hearts and great ambitions, great ideological ambitions. I feel it acutely. I read my newspapers every day, my Washington Post and the New York Times. I know that they are not the only source. So I read my Heather Cox Richardson, and I try to get my daily dose of gloom. But above that, if I can helicopter above it, I take the view that these forces have been there throughout, and time and again, the embedded democratic culture in the United States has pushed back and I would say triumphed, but has pushed back successfully. I can think of no other country like the United States where that civic consciousness, embedded democratic tradition, democratic culture, voluntary organizations have worked throughout the whole of the American history to speak to the better angels of the public and to bring about a better tomorrow. The American dream is a fiction and it never realized, but I do think that has been an inspiring ambition, an inspiring motive in the American past. These
are very eloquently expressed sentiments. I believe I've been told that Jim Oakes can now participate and wants to speak to this question. Jim, are you there?
Can you hear me? Can everybody
Yeah.
hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I'll be a little bit polemical here and say that I think that the universalist principles that Lincoln represented and most effectively in the speech that Richard quoted earlier about can't we just stop all this quibbling about this race, that race, the other person being inferior, superior, and go back to the universal principle of fundamental human equality. I think that principle, if that's your guiding principle in a democracy, you are impelled toward coalition building, which is what Lincoln was actively engaged in when he gave that speech, right? Getting those nativists to prioritize their anti-slavery convictions and that sort of thing, and building that coalition. And I think there is something about that universalist premise that is antithetical, potentially seriously antithetical to identity politics, which I think is intrinsically tends to break people down into subgroups and press their own individual identity concerns. And I think within the academy, I mean, Sean and Richard might feel differently about this, but my sense is that with the triumph of a kind of cultural history that took over in the last several decades, identity history became sort of dominant, and every department had to have, somebody studying this group, that's next subgroup, as opposed to having, departments that had a military historian and a political historian and an intellectual historian and an economic historian, and somebody who did the 18th century. We have a different conception of what a diverse faculty looks like, but from a certain perspective, it's much less diverse, and it does not produce, and that's sort of a mini version of what was happening in the politics in general. And I think we are in very dark times, but there are symptoms that there are certain signs, certainly certain here in New York City, that a kind of universalist politics is being reasserted, and repudiating the various identity categories, not just bringing everybody in, coalition building around economic issues, for example, that matter to people. I don't know where it's going to end, because we're in a serious fight for the life of our democracy. But I do think that if your politics don't start from that universalist premise of fundamental human equality, you're going to get lost.
Thank you, Jim. Eric, would you like to speak? And then I will sum up.
Sure, briefly, because I think that this question of recognizing the extreme danger in the present political moment, I mean, after all, it's now been 5.5 years since January 6th. All of the people who are responsible are either in government or free. Meanwhile, people who are engaging in protests at ICE concentration camps are getting, 30, 40, 50-year sentences for shooting off fireworks and moving boxes of literature in their homes. That's the moment that we're in, and all of the efforts which have been made by the Democratic Party and the New York Times and the proponents of identity politics, I think, with all of the themes that we've been discussing, to undermine that democratic consciousness, could not be more apparent how absolutely devastating that has been in a very concrete way. I mean, the Prairie Land case is not being addressed in the media. If you were in a country where there was appreciation in the bourgeois press for the basic democratic principles that they've been trying to overturn, this would be something that would be a banner headline and mass demonstrations taking place everywhere. But I think what this comes to, and I think on the point that Professor Oakes makes, the coalition building perhaps is less with the Democratic Party, which is the one that has promulgated all of this and which is responsible for all the laws that are used against immigrants. They're all bipartisan. the Clinton administration and Obama administration are the two worst examples of that. And there are many, many ways to talk. One could talk about that subject for hours, but there is a working class, and it's as yet. I mean, there are profound historical, cultural, political issues that have to be clarified. But to take the phrase coalition building and turn it in a slightly different direction, the building of a mass movement where the democratic questions that we're talking about here are connected, and maybe this is also what you're referring to the basic economic needs of tens of millions of people, and also to understand that these, of course, are not just American processes. But I think that I agree with what people here have said. There's tremendous potential for that. We're entering into a historical period, though, where it's incumbent on everybody here and everybody who's watching to really fight to deepen their historical knowledge on these questions. And yes, we're not flag waving here. This is the purpose of this discussion, is not to have a rally round the flag moment, but it is to understand that this country does have powerful revolutionary traditions, and that they, in the working class, they can be awoken. So no, I think it's been an important meeting.
Well, I'll take advantage of the being the moderator and having a chance to sum up. I think this has been an immensely important discussion, and I think it illustrates the need for many such discussions. If I can say parenthetically, I was quite upset by the fact that the death of Gordon Wood was barely reported in the major media. But if a rock star or an athlete beats an untimely end, it's enormous news. No disrespect intended, but the contribution of Gordon to the intellectual life of the country was enormous. And as we approach the 250th anniversary, there should be extensive discussions, reviews, and debates over what these great documents and what these great events mean, not just in the past, but for the present and the future of humanity. We are engaged in the struggle. My interpretation of this as a Marxist is that what predominates, frankly, is what I would call a petty bourgeois view of history, the substitution and the final analysis of various forms of identity, particularly race, for class. Class is a scientific category. Race is not a scientific category. It's not a legitimate biological category. It is a distorted and false view of society which divides people up on entirely scientifically ungrounded terms. It's a substitution of a perverted zoological conception which has no application to social history. In terms of where we stand, why is the knowledge of history so important? Because it adds complexity to our understanding of the present. It enables us to locate a moment with all its difficulties in a far broader historical trajectory. Yes, to quote Lincoln, our occasion is piled high with difficulties. This is not the first time such a situation has existed. Things have frequently looked impossible, and generally it looks most impossible at the point in which the greatest change is in the offing. If I had to make a prediction, I would say the America and the world of 2036 will look vastly different from the world of today. There are enormous forces in the world which are emerging. We live in a globalized society. There is an international working class. This very discussion will be followed all over the world in countless languages. The barrier of language is being broken down. We all know that. We have extraordinary technological instruments today which have transformed and are revolutionizing communications, have revolutionized technology. For all its problems, augmented intelligence will have enormous implications for the expansion of human knowledge. But what the greatest challenge of our time is the fight for a historical consciousness, for an understanding, to overcome all the ideological and political impediments to a historical approach to the study of contemporary reality. And I think such an approach makes optimism possible. Pessimism is a very superficial way of looking at society. It's a one-sided way. To be an optimist is to see not only the difficulties, but contained within those difficulties, the possibility of renewal. Historically, and I'm sure all of you will agree, who could have imagined in 1855 that slavery would be gone by 1865? It would have seemed impossible. The slave power was so enormous. Who could have believed that the Declaration would become such a powerful instrument for the mobilization of masses of people, and that the greatest American president would invoke in 1863 the document of 1776? And I just want to add to what Richard has said about Lincoln. You can't write Lincoln out of history, and you can't write Thomas Jefferson out of history either. He is the author, after all, of a number of the most memorable political sentences in the English language. In concluding, I just want to make a point that many of the titles which we have referred to today are available on Mehring Books. We urge all of our readers and participants to take advantage, to go to Mehring Books and to obtain the writings of all the historians who are present today, Sean, Jim, Richard, Adam, and Tom. And I also want to bring to your attention a volume which has just been put out by Mehring Books entitled Oligarchy, Trump and the Breakdown of American Democracy. It's a very, very, very important book which traces the process of the last 10 years. And I think understanding it also sees its fragility and the possibility for the defeat of Trump and all that he represents. So I want to conclude again by thanking all of our participants for taking time. I know that some of you really had to sweat it out to participate. Thank you very, very much. And I hope that we'll have another opportunity to continue this discussion and help the working class understand its great history and utilize that history as a weapon for if I may say, a socialist future. Thank you very much.